Good morning. Thank you very much, Ishmael. We're delighted to be here at the library again for this very important conference on Biovision 2014. Yesterday morning in the inaugural session, we heard a very interesting presentation by the Minister of State for Environment, Laila Ishkandar, in which she talked about some of the environmental challenges that Egypt faces and some of the efforts that are underway and initiatives to address those challenges. In fact, the whole world is faced with serious environmental challenges, enough to preoccupy the minds of thoughtful people around the world. But that's not all we're facing. If we look more broadly, we can see that today global society is faced with multidimensional challenges covering virtually all aspects of global social life. The challenge, the awakening aspiration for political freedom and human rights, which is spreading around the world, as you know so well here and have demonstrated. The recent financial crisis, the growing inequality that's there in all societies and between countries in the world, the slowing of economic growth, rising levels of unemployment, the deterioration of the social welfare network, which is impacting on the sustainability of society, the stability of society. The problems of energy and ecology, peace and international security. And as we become a more unified global society, the great challenges and difficulties in governing and developing rules and principles by which we will all live together peacefully. Last June, the Library of Alexandria hosted a meeting in partnership with the World Academy of Art and Science to look at these multiple challenges. It's part of an ongoing program of the Academy in collaboration with the library and other organizations to see whether or not there's any possible framework that could address all of these multiple challenges together. It might be possible, even appear on paper, relatively easy if our target was only one of them. If we really want to attack the challenge of climate change, we could simply say we're not going to have any more economic growth. But that's not a viable solution in any society in the world today. We need to look at more comprehensive solutions. And when we do that, it becomes apparent that among the important factors that are needed in order to effect solution to any and all of these problems, education plays a central role. We are not going to make real, steady, substantial breakthroughs on any of these problems without a significant development, extension, and increasing the quality and content of education at the global level. Education is really the driver. Education is the technology that human beings have invented for conscious social evolution, so that we can go beyond the process of trial and error experimentation. We can learn from our past experiences. We can draw on the essence of all our collective experience in the past and pass on the essence of that knowledge in an organized, abridged form to the next generation. So hopefully the next generation doesn't have to repeat all of the mistakes that we've made in the past or reinvent and relearn everything that's happened in the past. But somewhat ironically, the institution of education is, in some respects, part of our problem as well. Because while technology has been changing very rapidly, while the world, global society has been changing rapidly, while climate has been changing much too rapidly, education, more or less, in many respects, remains pretty much the same paradigm that we had 100 years ago. Oh, there are a lot more people involved. We have a lot more specialized subjects. We're using some new technology to disseminate education. Many poor people are benefiting from it, but fundamentally, our system of education is evolving much more slowly than the rapid pace of change in the society as a whole. So one of our challenges is how to accelerate the evolution of education. And today, we want to talk particularly about higher education, but that's not in any way to exclude or minimize the importance of education at all levels. This issue has many dimensions to it, and I'm just going to touch on a few here. One of the first and greatest is the quantitative dimension, a soaring demand for education. And if you look at the figures, there are different projections. One of the ones that comes from UNESCO is that in the next decade or so, the global educational system, higher educational system, would need to expand by about 95 million seats in order to accommodate those who are likely to seek entry. And that would be equivalent to founding 3 universities the size of Harvard every week for the next 10 years. And as we all know, new institutions of higher learning take a long time to grow up. And that's not the whole issue. If the entire world is to seek levels of higher education that are prevalent in the West, the actual increase would have to be about 4 times this level. 4 times, about 360 million seats in higher educational institutions around the world. And that's not going to happen anytime soon. 1, because it's very, very costly. 2, it's a very slow process. And 3, already in many countries, there's a serious shortage of trained faculty, competent faculty. I've done a lot of work in South India. In India today, if they wanted to reach these global standards, India would have to multiply its entire educational system 4-fold. Already there's a shortage of about 500,000 faculty members in the existing universities. They would need to add another 4 or 5 million, let alone the investment and the time. So there is an enormous quantitative challenge. But that's not all. I think as we're all aware, there's a tremendous qualitative challenge as well. Within countries, between countries, even within universities, our standard of what would really be excellence in education and what very often prevails as the reality, there's a huge gap, a qualitative gap. And as Ishmael brought out in his presentation yesterday on the knowledge revolution, a quantitative extension of education by itself is not enough. The data shows, the research shows, that unless there's also a qualitative improvement, the impact will be minimal, will be far from what is necessary. So simultaneous with an enormous expansion, we have to look for ways for an enormous qualitative upgrading of this system globally. And as we all know, when you expand horizontally, quality tends to go down. So to try to expand quality and raise quality at the same time is really a monumental challenge. In addition, we have other challenges. The very fact that we're suffering from serious global challenges today is partly the result of the fact that current theory, the current content of what we're teaching, and I'm particularly referring to the social sciences where I work, is far from adequate to meet the needs of society in the 21st century. Our economic science is still working on principles that were evolved during the Industrial Revolution. We are now into a knowledge and service-based economy where things are quite different. and yet we're very much looking at principles that are still based on a time of scarcity. Today, our problem is not that the world lacks production capacity. Our problem is we lack a system that can utilize that production capacity to distribute benefits to all who need it. We have about $225 trillion in global financial assets, but 80% of that money is not used for the real economy at all. We have surplus of funds, we have surplus of production technology, but our economic science is not giving us the policies and institutional framework to utilize that for the well-being of all. So we have a content problem. And we also have a great challenge of relevance. How relevant is what we are teaching, what our students are learning around the world today to the society that they're growing into, to the needs of the 21st century, to meet their own aspirations. Too often we are still educating people to be qualified for jobs that don't exist, rather than giving them the skills, the attitudes, the knowledge, and the know-how to create their own work, productive work, in a society that's changing. So relevance is a critical issue as well. Ishmael talked yesterday about the revolution in knowledge, and he talked about some of the exciting work being done at the library at the leading edge of this revolution, and told us that was only a tip of the work that's being done in the library. Today we're talking about a revolution in education. And that may seem, from sit here, perhaps a little presumptuous. Are we really in the middle of a revolution in education? Are we really on the cusp of a breakthrough in education? 6 months ago, my colleagues and I were in Berkeley, California, where the World Academy organized a conference, which we'll share more with you about later, where we saw firsthand the seeds of an emerging revolution in higher education that's not going to stop anytime soon. It's not going to stop until it spreads all over the world. It's not going to stop until it meets some of the needs that are not being met today. We're at an early stage of that, but we feel this is the time we should be thinking about it. This is the time we should be asking ourselves, where do we want this revolution to go? What type of revolution do we really need in higher education? There are some deep driving forces that are making this happen. Rising expectations all over the world are driving demand for higher education, whether or not the society is ready to absorb those who have it. Democratization is universalizing the demand and access to education, often with the result of pushing down educational standards. In order to handle the larger numbers, we've got a massification, a standardization of the product. It's becoming more and more standardized, which means less and less attuned to individual needs, and probably less and less attuned to the diversity of needs that society has. At the same time, we've got a movement of commercialization, where business around the world is coming in to make up for the deficit, the gaps that are left by the incapacity of the public sector to meet all of the educational aspirations of the population. We've got rising unemployment levels in most countries, driving a push towards more vocationalization, towards an education that's going to really solve our job problem. We've got much greater demand for public accountability than has been traditional in the educational sphere, where education was really left to the universities, but around the world the public expectations are rising much more. And last, and certainly not least, we have radical changes in technology that are driving this process. I'm sure you're all aware, you read about it in the papers, perhaps some of you have been involved and are participating already, but we are just in the tip of a technological revolution in education, most well known and characterized by what we call the MOOCs, the massive open online courses. Today, there are something more than 10 million students around the world who are participating in online courses. It's closer to 20 million. By 2020, the projections are that 50% of higher educational courses in the United States will be delivered online, and about 10% worldwide. And that still will represent an early stage in this revolution. Right now, about 22% of the students are coming from the United States. The second, Brazil, India, China are not far behind. The fastest growing markets, Malaysia, Vietnam, Africa is growing by about 15%. But this is still at the early stages. In 2012, there were 100 courses available online globally. Now there are about 1,200. They're adding about 2 courses a day. And I'd say that within the next 3 or 4 years, we'll be talking about 5,000 to 10,000 courses, not only in English, but more and more. About 2/3 of them are in English now, but there's a massive effort going on in Latin America for Spanish and now Portuguese. And as we saw yesterday, the exciting technology that the library's been working on for translation, this is going to help multiply the capacity to translate programs, courses from one language to another. So non-English language platforms are growing very fast. Research so far, and the research is in its early stages, but what it tells us is that online learning by itself is not a solution for many things, for most things, but it's a very powerful tool to complement the traditional classroom learning. And the data that we've seen and were presented at our conference show that when you combine the 2 methods, what they call the hybrid method, you can increase the efficacy of learning by about 50%. 50% greater than the classroom, 50% greater than online by itself. So this is resulting in a lot of experimentation, in a lot of questioning of the traditional role of faculty, the traditional role of the classroom and the lecture, and we are going to have to learn new skills and new ways. This is also questioned. One of the most interesting things we heard as we went around and talked to people in California at the universities who are pioneering this, people at Stanford and Berkeley and other places, was, we've spent decades trying to perfect what we teach students, but we've spent very little effort in the last half-century trying to understand how students learn. And this online learning is changing that. We're now compelled to ask ourselves not what we want to infuse to the student, but how can the students learn best? And what combination of methods and approaches will give the maximum learning impact in the shortest time? And that raises many other important questions, which we're going to discuss in the next session, on what is the purpose of that learning? What do we really need to impart? This also, apart from quantitative growth, also makes possible some dramatic increase or breakthrough on the qualitative side. And this is still very early. But just imagine for a moment, if you will, that you as students, many of you are students, have the opportunity to go online and access the world-class #1 faculty on any course that you took, or maybe more than one, and see how this course is being taught anywhere in the world, how this course is being taught by people with different capacities, different viewpoints, different inspiration. Certainly the potential of this technology for enhancing the quality, for supplementing what's available in a local university, for increasing the range of knowledge and capacity is enormous. And we're just at the earliest stage of that, where the greatest tool we have to understand it is our imagination. And those who think of the future can help create that future. At the same time, we've got a much greater opportunity for other partners to collaborate and contribute to the development of what we call higher education. Organizations like the Library of Alexandria and many of the organizations we partner with, like Green Cross International, which is operating all over the world on environmental issues, they have a tremendous knowledge, practical knowledge, grappling with issues in the field that doesn't get back easily into the educational curriculum. Now, the new technology can make that backward integration possible. We talked a few weeks ago with the Director General of the UN in Geneva. He's very interested in working with us on how do you take the knowledge within the UN system and facilitate its backward integration into the educational system around the world. So there's a possibility of new knowledge partners for development of new content that's more relevant, more fully adequate to meet our needs. At the same time, this technology opens up the possibility of involving people with a tremendous amount of expertise, retired teachers, skilled workers, experienced managers, entrepreneurs, to work together with the educational institutions to impart knowledge, to support the existing faculty, to handle much larger numbers, to change the role that the faculty play in interacting with students, and bring in people with different experience, complementary to that which is in the universities today. Yesterday, I think it was Ishmael who talked about the double helix and showed it on here. We are talking also about what a couple of our fellows of the Academy call the double helix of education and employment. In the future, the idea that education precedes career, and then we go for the rest of our life expressing what we've learned, is obviously got to change. Just 1 minute. It's obviously got to change. And the new technology makes possible that these two will grow together. So finally, it goes back to the question that Ishmael raised at the beginning. If you were asked to design an affordable, world-class system of higher education that would be available to everyone, everywhere, how would you do it? That's the rationale for the founding of the World University Consortium, and we are eager to interact with you and hear your ideas on how that can be done. Thank you.